There is one known photograph of a soapstone urn being taken from the ground on Catalina Island. Around that image grew a story of an extraordinary burial. A child, dozens of children, and a huge man said to have lain beneath them. Ralph Glidden made that claim public in 1928. A later retelling even gave the man a height, 7 feet 8 inches. But the photograph does not show that burial. The Catalina Island Museum says it does not substantiate Glidden's account, and says Glidden could not provide evidence for the elaborate scene he described. That leaves a more difficult question than the one on the old sensational headlines. If the giant was never proven, why has the story lasted so well? And what happened to the real human history underneath it? The answer is not a hidden skeleton waiting in some locked room. It is a documented trail, a collector, an island, a museum made from excavated remains, one photograph that cannot carry the weight placed on it, and a collection record damaged badly enough that later investigators cannot simply go back and settle the matter. Catalina Island, or Pimu, is not an empty stage on which a strange tale appeared. The island holds a deep human history. A National Park Service report notes datable human remains showing occupation there by about 10,000 years ago. Long before Glidden's claim entered popular retellings, this was a place of human lives, burials, travel, and belonging. In the early 20th century, Ralph Glidden excavated widely on Santa Catalina. The surviving accounts do not even give one clean numerical picture of his work. The Catalina Island Museum says he excavated at least 800 grave sites from more than 100 island locations during the early 1920s. An NPS report, drawing on a different earlier source and a broader span of years, gives different figures. Those totals may not be counting the same things. They should not be pressed together until they look precise. What is clear is the scale of the disturbance and collection. Glidden assembled material from his work and created a makeshift museum in Avalon. It displayed his collection, including human remains. The giant legend did not arise from a made-up internet photograph or an invented island. It attached itself to a real collector and to real ancestral traces taken from a real place. That is why the story deserves more than a quick laugh at an old tall tale. A false certainty can still grow around a real wound in the record. The harder we look at the legend, the more important it becomes to separate what Glidden said from what the surviving evidence can actually bear. The core of the story is specific. In 1928, Glidden publicly described a burial involving a soapstone urn, a young girl, 64 children, and a large man associated with a spear. It is a vivid arrangement. It has the shape of the kind of account people remember and repeat. The details accumulate until the listener can almost see a whole excavation laid out before them. But the accessible record does not allow us to see it. It preserves Glidden's claim, not a verified burial plan. The museum's account is blunt on this point. He did not produce evidence for the elaborate story. The one known photograph is of the urn's disinterment. It does not demonstrate the child, the group of children, the spear, the large man, the depth, the sequence, or the scene as a whole. That distinction is the first thing the legend asks us to ignore. A photograph can be genuine and still fail to prove the conclusion later attached to it. Here, the image gives the story a physical anchor. It does not give it a giant. The number 7 feet 8 inches needs the same discipline. A later Los Angeles Times account reported that Glidden had described the man that way. The accessible material does not provide a field measurement, a surviving skeleton, or an osteological record that would let us treat the number as established fact. It belongs to the afterlife of the claim. It may tell us something about how large the story became. It does not tell us the measured stature of a person. There is no need to make this boundary sound timid. It is the point of the investigation. The claim was made. The urn photograph exists. The evidence for the claimed burial does not. Those are not competing moods. They are the record. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and leave a like. It helps this channel keep following the places, objects, and records that have nearly disappeared beneath more convenient versions of the past. Once the photograph has been read honestly, the next question is unavoidable. If Glidden excavated so much material, displayed it, and left behind images, why can't later researchers simply check the collection and decide what happened? Because a collection is not the same thing as a chain of evidence. An archaeological burial is more than the objects or remains removed from the ground. Its meaning depends on connections, where it was found, what lay near it, what layer it came from, which notes were made at the moment of excavation, which images belong to it, and whether later labels still match the original context. Take those links away, and the material can remain physically present, while the knowledge that made it interpretable begins to break apart. The National Park Service has described Glidden's surviving documentation as falling far short of modern archaeological fieldwork standards. That is not a modern insult added to make an old figure look careless. It is a practical limit on what can be reconstructed from his work. A later researcher may hold a photograph, a box, a catalog entry, or an old account and still not know whether the pieces belong together. The archive itself shows both survival and limitation. The National Museum of the American Indian holds hundreds of Glidden's black and white negatives from 1919 through 1923. Most depict views and archaeological excavations on 4 Channel Islands, and some show excavated objects now in museum collections. These negatives are valuable historical material. They are also subject to cultural sensitivity restrictions, and a collection-level archive description cannot authenticate a particular image as Glidden's alleged 1928 burial. That detail matters because it prevents an easy answer in either direction. The negatives do not prove a giant. Their existence does not prove that no other evidence ever existed. They show that a large visual record survived in fragments with limits on access and identification. The question is not whether there is a folder somewhere that will automatically settle every claim made around the collection. The question is whether the surviving pieces still preserve the relationships needed for an honest test. Later research found serious reason to doubt that they do. Scholars examining Glidden collections reported provenance and provenance that could be missing, wrong, or more complicated than earlier descriptions suggested. Provenance is the exact place and context from which something came. Provenance follows the later history of an item, who held it, moved it, labeled it, or collected it. In a story about a claimed burial, both are essential. One of the most consequential findings was not that every item had been deliberately mislabeled. The evidence does not support a blanket charge like that. It was that Glidden's practices could sever the very links later investigators needed. Research associated with the Catalina Island project described a problematic skeletal collection and warned that conclusions drawn from it should be treated as suspect. The work also found that some remains may have come from outside their assumed original contexts, including through purchases made without regard to origin. That is a quieter problem than a conspiracy, but it is harder to live with. A conspiracy gives the viewer a villain, a decision, and a locked door. Bad records give us something less satisfying, a history that may have been made unanswerable through collection practices that did not preserve enough of what later people would need to know. It also changes the meaning of the giant story. At first, the missing proof seems to answer a single question. No verified giant can be drawn from the accessible evidence, but the same missing proof carries another cost. If the collection's contexts are compromised, then the damage does not stop at one extravagant claim. It reaches into the ordinary, difficult work of identifying what belongs where, what can be inferred, and how ancestral remains should be described. This is where the legend stops being just a rumor about unusual bones. It becomes a story about what happens when human remains are turned into objects of display and claims outlive the context that might have answered for them. Glidden's museum in Avalon was not a neutral archive waiting for a future researcher to decode it. It was a public collection assembled under methods that later scholarship found deeply limiting. The records that survive can tell us that he excavated, collected, displayed, and announced. They cannot safely supply the full chain from a particular burial to a particular story to a particular set of remains. The temptation is to fill that blank with the accusation that an institution must have hidden the proof. The surviving sources do not establish that. No document in this record shows the Smithsonian, the Catalina Island Museum, or any other institution secretly removing evidence of giants. Absence of a reliable field record is not evidence of a cover-up. It is evidence of a limit in the record. The ordinary explanation is not glamorous, but it fits what researchers found: inadequate documentation, complicated or missing provenance, and a collection shaped by methods that did not preserve a dependable path back to every original context. That explanation does not make the past less troubling. It makes it more troubling in a way that can be documented. Consider what the one photograph is being asked to do. It is the surviving image connected to the urn story. It can show an urn being disinterred. It cannot identify every person said to have been present. It cannot measure a body outside its frame. It cannot certify a spear wound. It cannot tell us whether all the reported elements belong to one burial. It cannot speak for the people whose remains were excavated. And it cannot repair the notebooks, tags, locations, and associations that were not preserved well enough. The image is not useless. It is a genuine fragment, but a fragment is not a verdict. That is not an invitation to shrug and move on. It is a demand for patience with the difference between a published claim and a proven finding. The missing links should stay visible, not be filled with a better story simply because the old one is easier to remember. Researchers working on Pimu Catalina Island did not approach these limits as an invitation to abandon the past. Their work described collaboration with Tongva community members and the need to investigate the background of problematic collections. That approach does not allow a narrator to speak for every Tongva person, or to pretend all questions of affiliation and return have one simple public answer. It does show why provenance is not a technical footnote. When context is wrong or missing, it can affect more than a museum label. It can complicate cultural affiliation, historical interpretation, and efforts to return ancestors to the correct home. The harm is not repaired by declaring every item solved. It is not repaired by treating every object as unknowable either. The difficult work is to say exactly what the record supports and exactly where it stops. There is a later official document that makes this boundary especially clear. In 2016, a National Park Service notice recorded that the Catalina Island Museum had completed an inventory and described a procedure for transfer of control after a notice period. That notice matters. It records an institutional process. But it is not public proof of the final disposition of every remain, and it does not identify the alleged giant from Glidden's story. This may sound like a narrow legal distinction. In this case, it protects the truth from becoming another version of the legend. A completed inventory is not the same as a completed return in every individual case. A procedure is not the same as a public answer about a particular person. The record has to be allowed to say only what it says. By now, the old question has changed shape. The important fact is not that some secret finally explains the giant. The important fact is that the giant claim is easier to trace than the burial it describes. We can follow the public announcement. We can see the one surviving urn photograph. We can see the later judgment that Glidden's documentation was inadequate. We can see researchers confronting missing and complicated provenance. Put those facts together, and the story's origin becomes clearer than its supposed discovery. The legend did not survive because a verified skeleton kept demanding an explanation. It survived because a vivid claim had enough real material around it to feel anchored, while the information required to test it was weakened or lost. That is the turn in the case. The blank space is not proof that something impossible was taken away. It is evidence that a collection can preserve bodies, objects, pictures, and public stories while losing the relationships that would let later people understand them responsibly. The cost of that loss belongs in the present tense. The Gabrielino/Tongva nation identifies Pimu, Santa Catalina, as part of its traditional territory and says it is involved in conservation on the island today. This does not tell us what every Tongva person thinks about Glidden, the giant story, or the use of old images. It does tell us that the island's history is not the property of a vanished people who can no longer answer back. That present connection changes the posture of the investigation. The responsible question is not, how much spectacle can this old claim still produce? It is, what can this record honestly tell us about a place and its ancestors? And what must it stop pretending to know? For the giant claim, the answer is firm. The accessible evidence does not verify a 7-foot 8-inch person. It does not substantiate Glidden's elaborate burial. It does not document a hidden removal of proof. A future field note or object could perhaps clarify what Glidden reported at the time, but even that would need reliable context and credible measurement before it could change the biological claim. For the larger history, the answer is less neat. Catalina Island's human past is real and deep. Glidden's excavations, collection, museum, announcement, and surviving images are part of the documented record. So are the failures that limit what can be made of that record now. The work of reconstructing context is not an afterthought to the legend. It is the only honest way through it. Return then to the urn photograph. It has survived when much else has not. It is evidence of an excavation and a claim's physical setting. It is not evidence of the crowded burial story attached to it. The photograph does not need to become a ghostly clue to matter. It is enough to see what it is. One real fragment, carrying less than the legend demands, and more than we have any right to invent around it.